The steel door gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the underground facility. Detective Sarah Chen stood before it, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air of the basement. 20 feet below the streets of Los Angeles, in a reinforced concrete bunker that few people knew existed, she was about to step into history. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the combination lock. This was a moment she had been preparing for, yet nothing could have prepared her for what waited inside. 3 weeks earlier, Sarah had received a call that changed everything. A routine estate audit had uncovered something unusual in the property records of Michael Jackson's former residence. Hidden beneath layers of legal paperwork and deliberately obscured by decades of careful planning was a reference to a vault. Not just any vault, but a specially constructed chamber that had been sealed since 2009. The executors of the estate had finally granted permission for it to be opened, and Sarah, as the lead investigator for the Los Angeles County Special Investigations Unit, had been chosen to document whatever lay within. The combination had been kept in a safe deposit box at 3 different banks, each holding one portion of the sequence. It had taken 2 weeks just to gather all the pieces and verify their authenticity. Sarah input the numbers carefully, hearing each tumbler click into place with a sound that echoed through the empty corridor. Her assistant, Marcus Webb, stood behind her with camera equipment ready. They had been partners for 7 years, investigating everything from art fraud to historic property disputes. But this case felt different. This felt monumental. The final number clicked, and the massive door began to swing open with a hydraulic hiss. A rush of climate-controlled air escaped, carrying with it the faint scent of age paper and something else Sarah couldn't quite identify. As the door opened fully, motion sensor lights flickered to life inside, revealing a space that seemed to exist outside of time itself. The vault was larger than she had expected, roughly the size of a small apartment, with walls lined with custom-built shelving units and climate-controlled display cases. Sarah stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the floor. The temperature was precisely controlled, maintained at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit with 40% humidity. Every surface was dust-free, preserved by an advanced air filtration system that had continued running automatically for over a decade. Marcus followed her in, his camera already recording every detail. The first thing that struck them both was the sheer volume of material. Thousands of items were carefully organized and labeled, each one tagged with dates and detailed descriptions in handwritten notes. Along the left wall stood row after row of archival boxes, each one marked with years spanning from the late 1960s to 2009. Sarah approached the nearest box and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were journals, hundreds of them, bound in leather and filled with handwritten entries. She picked one up at random and opened it to a page dated March 15th, 1983. The handwriting was precise and flowing, describing in vivid detail the creative process behind a song that would later become one of the most iconic tracks in music history. But these weren't just dry technical notes. These were intimate reflections, fears, hopes, and dreams poured onto paper in the quiet hours of the night. Moving deeper into the vault, Sarah discovered something that made her heart race. An entire wall was dedicated to unreleased music. Not just recordings, but complete songs with full production notes, alternate versions, and experimental tracks that had never been heard by anyone outside the recording studio. There were master tapes, digital recordings, and even some tracks stored on formats that would require specialized equipment to play. Each one was meticulously labeled with the date of recording, the musicians involved, and notes about the creative direction Jackson had envisioned. But it was what stood in the center of the vault that truly took Sarah's breath away. On a custom-built platform sat a collection of personal artifacts that told a story beyond the public persona everyone knew. There were costumes from performances that had never been documented, prototypes of stage designs for tours that were planned but never executed, and sketches for inventions that showed a mind constantly pushing boundaries. One item in particular caught her eye, a leather-bound book with no title, secured with a small lock that had long since tarnished with age. Sarah carefully photographed the lock before attempting to open it. The metal gave way easily, and inside she found something unexpected. Page after page of letters, written but never sent, addressed to people from every phase of Jackson's life. Some were tender and nostalgic, reaching out to childhood friends and early mentors. Others were painful to read, expressing hurt and confusion over betrayals and misunderstandings. There were letters to his children, dated years before they were born, describing the father he hoped to become and the world he wanted to create for them. As the hours passed, Sarah and Marcus worked methodically through the vault, documenting everything. They found evidence of philanthropic efforts that had never been publicized, including detailed plans for a children's hospital network and an educational foundation that would have provided free arts education to underprivileged communities worldwide. There were contracts ready to be signed, architectural drawings, and feasibility studies. These weren't just dreams scribbled on napkins. These were fully developed plans with budgets, timelines, and partnerships already arranged with major institutions. The magnitude of what they were uncovering began to sink in. This wasn't just a collection of memorabilia or a time capsule of fame. This was a complete record of a mind that never stopped creating, dreaming, and reaching for something beyond what already existed. Every item told a story, and together they painted a picture far more complex and profound than the public had ever known. Sarah realized they weren't just investigating a vault. They were uncovering the true legacy of one of the most misunderstood figures in modern history. Sarah returned to the vault the following morning with a team of audio specialists. The unreleased music was too significant to handle alone, and she needed experts who could properly assess and preserve the recordings without risking damage to the original masters. Dr. Raymond Torres, a renowned audio archivist from the Library of Congress, had flown in overnight specifically for this purpose. As they gathered around a collection of tapes and digital files, the weight of responsibility hung heavy in the air. The first tape they selected was marked simply Neverland Sessions, 1998, Track 7. Raymond carefully loaded it onto a specialized playback system designed to handle fragile magnetic tape. The room fell silent as he adjusted the levels and pressed play. What emerged from the speakers was nothing short of extraordinary. The song began with a simple piano melody, haunting and beautiful, before Jackson's voice entered with a vulnerability that was startling in its rawness. This wasn't the polished, produced sound everyone knew. This was something more intimate, more human, more real. The lyrics spoke of isolation despite being surrounded by millions of admirers. They described the paradox of fame, the way it could elevate you to the heavens while simultaneously trapping you in a prison of expectations and scrutiny. As the song progressed, additional layers were added in real time during the recording session. You could hear Jackson directing musicians, explaining the emotional texture he wanted, using metaphors and imagery to communicate feelings that went beyond technical musical terms. At one point, the recording captured him stopping mid-verse, saying the emotion wasn't right yet, and then starting over with an intensity that sent chills down Sarah's spine. Marcus was documenting everything, but even he had stopped to simply listen. The song built to a crescendo that incorporated elements of gospel, classical, and modern electronic music in a way that shouldn't have worked but somehow created something transcendent. When it finally ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Raymond was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. He explained that what they had just heard was a complete, fully produced song that could be released as is and would likely be considered one of Jackson's finest works. And there were hundreds more recordings in this vault. Over the next several hours, they listened to track after track, each one revealing a different facet of Jackson's artistic vision. There were collaborations with artists who had never publicly acknowledged working with him, experimental pieces that blended genres in ways that were ahead of their time, and several songs clearly written for specific social causes. One track, dated 2007, was an environmental anthem with production so innovative that Raymond kept rewinding sections just to understand how certain sounds had been created. The lyrics call for immediate action on climate change, describing a future world transformed by human negligence, but also offering hope through collective action and consciousness shift. Another discovery sent shockwaves through the team. Tucked behind the main collection was a sealed case containing what the label described as the Healing Album, Complete 2008. Inside were 12 songs, fully mixed and mastered, with album artwork already designed and a detailed release strategy outlined in accompanying notes. Sarah carefully examined the documentation. According to Jackson's notes, this album was meant to be released anonymously, with all proceeds going directly to medical research for children's diseases. He had wanted the music to succeed or fail purely on its own merit, without the weight of his name attached. The songs on this album were unlike anything in his public catalog. They were deeply personal, dealing with themes of redemption, forgiveness, and the search for peace in a chaotic world. One song, titled Mirror of Truth, was particularly striking. It featured Jackson singing a duet with himself, one voice representing the public persona and the other the private person, engaging in a conversation about identity, authenticity, and the cost of living in the spotlight. The production was sparse, allowing the lyrics and vocal performance to carry the emotional weight. It was powerful and deeply moving. As they continued their exploration, they found extensive notes about the creative process behind each song. Jackson had documented everything. The initial spark of inspiration, often coming from interactions with his children or observations of the world around him, the development of melodies and harmonies, with alternate versions and explanations of why certain choices were made, and the final production decisions, including detailed instructions for mixing that showed an understanding of audio engineering that rivaled professional producers. These weren't just songs thrown together quickly. Each one was a carefully crafted piece of art, refined over months or even years. But perhaps the most significant discovery was a series of recordings that could only be described as audio documentaries. Jackson had recorded himself discussing his philosophy on music, art, and social responsibility. In these recordings, he spoke at length about his belief that artists had a duty to use their platform for positive change. He discussed specific social issues he cared about, from children's rights to environmental conservation, and explained how he tried to weave these messages into his work without being preachy or heavy-handed. His voice in these recordings was thoughtful and articulate, a stark contrast to the sometimes childlike public persona many people associated with him. One recording stood out for its emotional intensity. Dated June 2009, just weeks before his death, Jackson spoke about legacy and what he hoped would be remembered about his life and work. He acknowledged his mistakes and the controversies that had surrounded him, expressing pain at how certain narratives had overshadowed his artistic contributions and humanitarian efforts. But he wasn't bitter or resentful. Instead, he expressed hope that future generations would judge him by the totality of his work and the positive impact he tried to have on the world. He spoke directly to his children, knowing they would grow up and eventually seek to understand who their father really was beyond the headlines. Sarah found herself deeply affected by these recordings. The person speaking in these tapes was thoughtful, intelligent, and deeply committed to making a positive difference in the world. It was a far cry from the tabloid caricature that had dominated media coverage for decades. As the day wore on and they continued to uncover more material, she began to understand that this vault wasn't just a storage space. It was a deliberate act of preservation, a way to ensure that the full story would eventually be told, that the complete picture of who Michael Jackson was and what he cared about would survive beyond the noise and distortion of fame. The journals proved to be the most time-consuming aspect of the investigation. Sarah had initially estimated it would take a few days to review them, but as she delved deeper into the handwritten pages, she realized it could take months to fully process everything contained within them. She enlisted the help of Dr. Patricia Morrison, a professor of cultural studies and biography who had written extensively about the intersection of fame, creativity, and personal identity. Together, they began the painstaking work of reading, documenting, and understanding the written legacy Jackson had left behind. The journals weren't organized chronologically, which initially frustrated Sarah's methodical nature. But as Patricia explained, this actually made them more valuable. Jackson had apparently returned to them randomly, adding reflections and updates to earlier entries, creating a complex web of thoughts that evolved over time. An entry from 1984 might have additions from 1999 and 2007, showing how his perspective on an event or decision had changed with maturity and experience. This created a unique opportunity to see not just what happened, but how his understanding of those events deepened over the years. The earliest entries, dating back to the Jackson 5 era, were written in the hand of a child still learning to process the surreal experience of sudden fame. Young Michael wrote about missing normal childhood activities, the pressure of being the lead singer, and the complicated dynamics within his family. But even at that young age, there was evidence of the thoughtful observer he would become. He wrote about watching people's behavior, noting how adults acted differently around famous children, how genuine affection could be difficult to distinguish from opportunistic flattery. These observations were sometimes heartbreaking in their precociousness. As the journal progressed through his teenage years and into young adulthood, a pattern emerged. Jackson was constantly analyzing his own creative process, breaking down why certain songs worked while others didn't, examining audience reactions, and pushing himself to evolve. There were pages filled with ideas for dance moves, described in elaborate detail before video technology made it easy to simply record and review choreography. He wrote about studying Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, and James Brown, dissecting their movements frame by frame in his mind, trying to understand what made them so compelling. But it was the entries from the thriller era that truly fascinated Sarah. This was a period when Jackson transformed from a successful artist into a global phenomenon, and the journals captured his conflicted feelings about that transformation. He wrote about the incredible high of creating something that resonated with so many people across different cultures and backgrounds. Yet on the same page, sometimes in the same paragraph, he expressed anxiety about being consumed by his own success. He described feeling like he was becoming more symbol than person, more icon than individual. The weight of expectations from fans, the industry, and himself was crushing, even as he was achieving heights no other performer had ever reached. One entry from November 1983 was particularly revealing. Jackson wrote about a moment alone in his house after the Motown 25 performance, where he debuted the moonwalk to a massive television audience. Despite the overwhelming positive response, he focused on the 2 seconds where he felt his timing was slightly off on a spin. He described this as both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, the inability to simply enjoy success without immediately identifying what could have been better. Patricia pointed out that this was a common trait among true perfectionists, but it also revealed the psychological toll that such high standards could take over a lifetime. The journals also contained extensive writing about his humanitarian work, and this was where Sarah found some of the most touching material. Jackson wrote about visits to children's hospitals, describing individual kids he had met, their stories, their courage in facing illness. These weren't brief mentions or celebrity anecdotes. These were pages and pages of detailed observations, showing that he had truly listened to these children, remembered their names and circumstances, and carried their stories with him. He wrote about feeling helpless in the face of their suffering, despite his wealth and fame, and his determination to do something meaningful to help beyond just providing momentary entertainment. In a journal from 1992, Sarah discovered detailed plans for what Jackson called the Bridge Project. This was an ambitious initiative to create cultural exchange programs for children from conflict zones around the world. The idea was to bring together young people from opposing sides of various conflicts, from the Middle East to Northern Ireland to various African nations, and help them collaborate on artistic projects. The theory was that children who created music, art, and dance together would be less likely to view each other as enemies as they grew into adults. The plans were incredibly detailed, with budgets, proposed partnerships with international organizations, and curriculum outlines. Sarah was stunned to discover that significant groundwork had actually been completed before the project was apparently shelved for reasons not clear from the journals. As they progressed into the journals from the later years, the tone shifted noticeably. The entries became more philosophical, grappling with deeper questions about purpose, legacy, and the nature of truth in an age of media manipulation. Jackson wrote extensively about the trial he faced in 2005, and these entries were painful to read. He expressed profound hurt at being accused of the very thing he stood against, using his platform and resources to protect children. He wrote about the process of being investigated and tried not in terms of his own discomfort, but in terms of what it meant for his mission to help children globally. He worried that the accusations would undermine all the legitimate work he had done and discourage other artists from engaging in similar humanitarian efforts. But what struck Sarah most powerfully was that even in these darkest entries, there was no bitterness toward children themselves. Despite everything he had been through, despite the accusations and the way they had destroyed his reputation in many people's eyes, he continued to write about children with hope, love, and a determination to make their world better. In one entry from 2006, he wrote about visiting an orphanage in Eastern Europe in secret, without press or fanfare. He described playing with children who had no idea who he was, seeing them simply respond to kindness and attention, and feeling more himself in those moments than he had felt in years. The final journals, from the last year of his life, were perhaps the most complex. Jackson was clearly preparing for the comeback concerts in London, writing about his nervousness and excitement in equal measure. He was physically struggling, dealing with chronic pain from decades of intense performance, and there were references to difficulty sleeping and anxiety about whether he could still deliver the kind of show his fans expected. But there was also genuine excitement about creating again, about proving that he still had something to offer. He wrote about wanting to show his children what he did, wanting them to see him at his best and understand why music mattered so much to him. In the very last entry, dated just days before his death, Jackson wrote about feeling at a crossroads. He described a sense that this was a pivotal moment, that the comeback could either revitalize his career and give him a platform to do the humanitarian work he still dreamed about, or it could be the final disappointment that ended everything. He wrote about his children, his hopes for their future, and his desire to be remembered as someone who tried to make a positive difference. The entry ended mid-sentence, the final words trailing off as if he had been interrupted or simply too tired to continue. Reading those final incomplete words, Sarah felt a profound sadness for a life that had been simultaneously extraordinary and deeply lonely. While the music and journals had captured most of the team's attention, it was Marcus who first noticed something unusual about one of the locked cabinets along the far wall of the vault. Unlike the others, which were clearly marked with contents and dates, this one had only a simple symbol etched into its face, a combination of musical notes and what appeared to be technical schematics. Sarah called in a locksmith, and when the cabinet finally opened, they discovered something entirely unexpected. Inside were blueprints, patent applications, and working prototypes for inventions that Jackson had apparently been developing in private. The first item they examined was a device that looked like a modernized version of a shoe, but with complex mechanisms built into the heel and sole. The accompanying documentation explained that Jackson had been working with engineers to develop performance footwear that would allow dancers to execute moves that would normally be impossible or dangerous. The design incorporated hydraulic systems so sophisticated that they would have been groundbreaking in the sports equipment industry. Sarah learned that Jackson had actually filed patents for several of these designs, though he had never publicly acknowledged his role as an inventor. But the footwear was just the beginning. Deeper in the cabinet, they found plans for what could only be described as a complete revolution in stage performance technology. Jackson had envisioned and partially developed a system of wireless audio, lighting, and video that would allow for performances of unprecedented complexity and flexibility. This wasn't idle dreaming. The technical specifications were detailed and practical, showing a deep understanding of engineering principles. Several of the concepts outlined in these plans had eventually been developed independently by others and were now standard in modern concert production, but Jackson's versions dated back to the early 2000s, years before similar systems came to market. Dr. Torres, who had stayed on to help with the investigation, was amazed by what they were uncovering. He explained that many successful artists dabble in technology and innovation, but what Jackson had created showed the mind of someone who thought systematically about problems and solutions. The documentation included extensive testing notes, failure analyses, and iterative improvements. This wasn't the work of someone playing at inventing. This was serious research and development. Torres theorized that Jackson had probably spent millions of his own money on these projects, working with professional engineers and designers who had been sworn to secrecy. Among the most fascinating discoveries were detailed plans for what Jackson called the empathy machine. The concept was ambitious, a combination of virtual reality, haptic feedback, and carefully composed music and narration that would allow people to experience life from perspectives radically different from their own. One prototype program was designed to let wealthy individuals experience what homelessness felt like. Another would allow people to experience the world as someone with severe disabilities. The goal, according to Jackson's notes, was to break down the walls of privilege and ignorance that prevented people from truly understanding and caring about other suffering. Sarah was struck by how these inventions aligned perfectly with the themes she had found in the journals and unreleased music. Everything connected to a central vision of using art and technology to increase human empathy and connection. The empathy machine prototypes included fully scripted experiences, with music Jackson had composed specifically for each scenario. There were also detailed notes about the psychological principles he was drawing on, referencing academic research on empathy development and perspective-taking. He had consulted with psychologists and neuroscientists, approaching the project with the same rigor a university research lab might use. But perhaps the most personally revealing invention was something simpler and more intimate. Tucked away in a small box was a device Jackson called a memory keeper. It was essentially an advanced audio recording system, but designed specifically to capture the voices and sounds of children as they grew. The idea was that parents could record everyday moments, not just special occasions, creating an audio documentary of their children's development. The device would automatically organize and preserve these recordings, creating a searchable archive that could be accessed throughout a person's life. Jackson had written extensively about his regret at not having more recordings of his own childhood voice, not remembering what he sounded like before the world knew who he was. The technical documentation showed that he had actually built several working prototypes of the memory keeper and had given them to friends and family members. Some of the most successful elements of his design had apparently influenced products that came to market years later, though without any public acknowledgement of Jackson's pioneering work. Sarah found detailed correspondence between Jackson and various technology companies where he had pitched the concept, only to see it rejected as not commercially viable. Years later, similar product appeared, and Jackson's note suggested he was aware of this but chose not to pursue legal action, writing that he cared more about families being able to preserve memories than about getting credit or compensation. As they continued to explore this section of the vault, they discovered that Jackson had been involved in philanthropic technology projects as well. There were prototypes and plans for low-cost medical devices designed for use in developing nations, including a portable water purification system and a solar-powered device for sterilizing medical equipment. These weren't just concepts. Several had been developed to working prototype stage with the help of university engineering departments that Jackson had quietly funded. The goal was to create devices that could be manufactured locally in the countries that needed them, providing both health benefits and economic opportunities. One project that was particularly advanced involved educational technology. Jackson had been working on developing interactive learning systems for children in under-resourced schools. The system combined adaptive software that could assess a child's learning style and pace with physical manipulatives and games that made learning engaging. The documentation showed that he had actually implemented pilot programs in several schools in Los Angeles and abroad, funding them anonymously through foundations. Teachers' reports included in the file showed remarkable success, with children who had been struggling academically suddenly thriving when given access to these tools and methods. Marcus discovered another fascinating element. Jackson had been experimenting with what would now be called biofeedback and wellness technology. He had devices designed to help performers manage stress and maintain vocal health, systems for monitoring and optimizing sleep quality, and even early versions of meditation and mindfulness apps, though that terminology wasn't used in his notes. It was clear that Jackson had been struggling with his own health and sleep issues and had channeled that struggle into trying to create solutions that could help others facing similar challenges. The sheer breadth of innovation was overwhelming. Sarah realized that while the world knew Michael Jackson as a performer and entertainer, he had also been quietly working on projects that could have had significant positive impacts in multiple fields. The question that haunted her was why all of this had remained hidden. Some answers were in the documentation itself: patent disputes, contractual complications, advisors warning him that public failure in business ventures could damage his primary career. But there seemed to be something else at play, a sense that Jackson was more comfortable creating and giving than promoting himself as a creator or seeking recognition for his innovations. In the very back of the cabinet, Sarah found one more item that tied everything together. It was a letter Jackson had written, apparently intended to be opened with the vault itself. In it, he explained his hope that these inventions and innovations would eventually be shared with the world, but only after his death, so that they could be judged on their merit rather than on his celebrity. He wrote about wanting to contribute to human progress in ways that transcended entertainment, wanting to leave behind tools and ideas that would continue helping people long after his music stopped playing. The letter ended with a simple request: that any profit from these inventions be used to fund the humanitarian projects outlined elsewhere in the vault, creating a self-sustaining legacy of positive change. 3 months after the initial discovery, Sarah found herself sitting in a secure conference room with representatives from the Jackson estate, historians, music industry executives, and legal experts. The contents of the vault had been fully catalogued, and now the difficult decisions had to be made about what would happen next. The room was tense with competing interests and perspectives. Some wanted everything released immediately, believing the public had a right to know the full story. Others argued for careful curation, protecting Jackson's artistic legacy by being selective about what was shared. The estate representatives were caught between honoring Jackson's wishes as expressed in his letter and their fiduciary duty to maximize value for his heirs. Sarah presented her findings methodically, walking through each category of discovery and explaining the significance of what had been found. When she finished, the room fell silent. It was Dr. Morrison who spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent months immersed in Jackson's private thoughts. She argued passionately that the contents of the vault fundamentally changed the historical narrative around one of the most famous people of the modern era. This wasn't just about entertainment history or music industry archives. This was about understanding how fame distorts truth, how media narratives can overshadow reality, and how a person's genuine humanity can be lost in the noise of celebrity culture. The music executives were primarily focused on the unreleased recordings. They saw immense commercial value and were already discussing release strategies, anniversary editions, and promotional campaigns. But Raymond Torres pushed back forcefully. He argued that releasing the music without proper context would repeat the same mistakes that had plagued Jackson throughout his life, reducing everything to commerce and spectacle while missing the deeper message. The unreleased songs weren't just product to be marketed. They were pieces of a larger puzzle that revealed an artist's true intentions and vision. They needed to be presented as part of the complete story the vault told. Legal complications quickly became apparent. The patent applications and inventions opened up questions about intellectual property that could take years to resolve. Some of the technology Jackson had developed had subsequently been patented by others. Had they independently arrived at the same innovations, or had there been leaks from the people Jackson had worked with? The estate's lawyers saw potential lawsuits that could drag on indefinitely. But the letter Jackson had written suggested he wouldn't have wanted that path. He had explicitly stated his desire for the innovations to be used freely to benefit humanity, even if it meant not receiving credit or compensation. As the discussion continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the bigger picture. The vault hadn't just contained objects and documents. It had contained a counter-narrative to the story the world thought it knew. Every item challenged assumptions, complicated simplistic judgments, and revealed depths that had been invisible behind the glare of fame. The journal showed a man of serious intellect and deep compassion. The unreleased music demonstrated artistic ambitions that went far beyond commercial success. The inventions proved a scientific and humanitarian mindset that few had suspected. And the letters revealed a person desperate to be understood while simultaneously protecting his privacy and that of his children. One of the estate representatives, a woman named Helen Chambers, who had worked directly with Jackson during the final years of his life, spoke up for the first time. She revealed something she had been authorized to share only if the vault contained what they suspected it might. Jackson had left specific instructions about how the vault should be handled. He had understood that releasing everything at once would be overwhelming and would inevitably be filtered through the same sensationalist lens that had distorted so much of his life. Instead, he had wanted the contents to be studied first by serious researchers, then gradually shared with the public through documentaries, books, and carefully curated releases over many years. Helen explained that Jackson had been deeply influenced by how other historical figures had been re-evaluated long after their deaths, once enough time had passed for emotional and cultural biases to fade. He believed that his full story could only be truly understood by future generations who hadn't been caught up in the tabloid controversies and media circuses that defined his later life. The vault was his attempt to preserve the evidence that would eventually allow for that fair reassessment. He had wanted to give history the tools to judge him accurately, even if his own generation never could. This revelation changed the energy in the room. The discussion shifted from what could be done with the vault's contents to what should be done, what Jackson himself had envisioned. A plan began to take shape. The contents would be preserved and studied by academic institutions. Selected materials would be released gradually, each one accompanied by proper historical context and scholarly analysis. The unreleased music would be shared, but as part of a larger project that explored Jackson's artistic philosophy and social vision. The inventions would be evaluated for their potential to still contribute to human welfare, with any resulting benefits funding the charitable projects Jackson had outlined. But Sarah knew there was one more crucial element that hadn't been addressed. She stood and shared her personal conclusion from 3 months of investigation. The vault, she argued, was ultimately about the cost of fame and the difficulty of authentic human connection in the modern world. Every item they had found spoke to a person trying desperately to be seen truly while being viewed constantly. Jackson had been one of the most watched, photographed, and discussed people on Earth, yet the vault revealed someone who felt profoundly misunderstood and alone. That paradox was a real story, more important than any individual discovery. The vault showed how someone could pour their heart into music that reached billions while feeling that their actual message was being missed. It showed how a person could be simultaneously loved by millions of fans and demonized by millions of others, with very few people attempting to see the complete, complex human being at the center. It demonstrated how wealth and fame could provide resources to help others while creating barriers to genuine friendship and trust. Most importantly, it revealed how the same media and public appetite that created a superstar could just as easily destroy a person's reputation based on allegation rather than evidence. Sarah pointed out that the journal contained repeated references to a concept Jackson called the cage of light. He described fame as being trapped in a spotlight so bright that it blinded everyone looking at you. They could see a figure, a shape, an outline, but never the real person. The cage kept you isolated while creating the illusion of constant connection. And the tragedy was that the more famous you became, the thicker the bars of that cage grew, until eventually you could barely see out anymore, and no one could see in. Everything in the vault was, in some way, Jackson's attempt to break through those bars, to communicate who he really was to a world that had constructed its own narrative about him. The room was quiet as Sarah finished. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly, adding that this was what made the vault historically significant beyond just its famous subject. It was a case study in how modern celebrity culture creates and destroys, elevates and isolates, reveals and obscures. Future researchers studying the nature of fame in the digital age would find invaluable data in these materials. The vault was simultaneously Michael Jackson's personal archive and a broader commentary on the relationship between public figures and society. As the meeting concluded, agreements were drafted and responsibilities assigned. Sarah's official investigation was complete, but she knew this was really just the beginning. The contents of the vault would be studied, debated, and analyzed for decades to come. Some people would embrace the new information and revise their understanding of Jackson. Others would remain committed to their existing beliefs, skeptical of anything that challenged their narrative. That was human nature, the same tendency that had made Jackson's life so difficult while he was alive. Walking out of the building that evening, Sarah thought about the final words of Jackson's letter that she hadn't shared with the room. He had written that he didn't need to be remembered as perfect or faultless. He knew he had made mistakes, had been human in all the complex ways that implied. What he hoped for was simply fairness, an opportunity for the complete story to eventually be told without the distortion of tabloid sensationalism or the simplification of hagiography. He wanted future generations to have access to the full picture and make their own informed judgments. The vault was his gift to that future, a time capsule of truth preserved beneath the rubble of controversy and myth. Sarah realized that in investigating its contents, she had been given a privilege few people ever received. The chance to see past the cage of light, to understand the person behind the icon. And now it was her responsibility to help ensure that understanding could eventually be shared with the world, not as a vindication or condemnation, but simply as a truth, complicated and human and real. The vault had left her speechless when she first opened it 3 months ago, but now it had given her words, evidence, and a mission to help set the record straight for history.